I helped a woman with a sick child on the highway, which cost me my business. But what happened next changed everything. You know those moments that just stick with you? The ones where you look back and think, damn, that really changed everything. For me, it started on a freezing Colorado night when I was just trying to get home. I'm Jeff, by the way, Jeff Reid. Just your average 44-year-old grease monkey from Denver with dirty fingernails and a back that reminds me I'm not 20 anymore. Been fixing cars since I was tall enough to see over a hood. Nothing special about me. I drive a beat-up 98 Ford F-150 that's probably more rust than metal at this point. Live in a modest house with my wife Laura and our 2 kids and mind my own business. That night, man, it was brutal. Temperature had dropped to something like 15 below. And the wind was howling like it had a personal vendetta against anyone stupid enough to be outside. The roads were slick with black ice, and the snow was coming down sideways. The radio was playing some old Johnny Cash. God's gonna cut you down. And I was tapping along on the steering wheel. Just wanted to get home, crack open a beer, and pass out on the couch. My day had been nothing but stubborn bolts and customers complaining about prices. Standard stuff. I almost missed them. With the snow and darkness, you could barely see 20 feet ahead. But something caught my eye on the shoulder of Highway 70, hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. Most folks would have kept driving. It was dangerous to stop, and I was exhausted. But something made me slow down. The car was an old Chevy sedan, probably early 2000s, with Colorado plates and a serious coating of road salt. As I pulled up behind it and flicked on my high beams, I could see someone moving around outside the vehicle, desperately trying to flag me down. A woman in a thin, worn-out coat was waving frantically. She looked about my age, maybe a bit younger, with dark hair whipping around her face in the wind. The fear in her eyes hit me before I even rolled down my window. Inside the car, a little girl was bundled up in what looked like every blanket they owned. Even from where I sat, I could hear her wheezing. My stomach dropped. Even with 2 kids at home, 12 and 14, I'd never heard that sound, that desperate struggle for air, and it does something to you. I grabbed my heavy work coat from the passenger seat and stepped out into the biting cold. The woman rushed toward me, panic written all over her face. She explained in rushed breaths that their car had died completely. The heat was gone. Her daughter had severe asthma, and they'd been stranded for almost an hour. Her phone was dead, and no one else had stopped. The little girl's lips were taking on a bluish tint that sent alarm bells ringing through my head. There wasn't time to think. My shop was about 10 minutes back the way I'd come. I grabbed the tow strap from my truck bed, connected our vehicles, and told them to steer while I pulled. The woman, Clara, she'd said her name was, nodded gratefully and hurried back to her daughter. Towing in those conditions was risky business. 15 miles per hour max, hazards blinking, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure they were still behind me. Johnny Cash had given way to a weather alert warning travelers to stay off the roads. A bit late for that advice. The 10-minute drive felt like an hour. Every time I hit a patch of ice or felt the truck slide slightly, my heart jumped into my throat. One wrong move could snap the tow strap or send us both spinning. When we finally pulled into the empty parking lot of Reid's Auto Repair, I'd never been so relieved to see my shabby little shop. The inside of the garage was cold, but nowhere near as brutal as outside. The familiar smell of motor oil, grease, and metal welcomed me as I flipped on the industrial lights. Clara carried her daughter in, still wrapped in blankets, and I cleared off my office chair for them. After cranking up the space heaters, I got to work on their car, popped the hood, checked the battery connections, tested the alternator. Classic case of a failed generator. Not something easily fixed on a roadside, but simple enough in a shop. While I worked, I kept glancing over at them. The little girl, Emma, I heard Clara call her, was still wheezing, though the warm air seemed to be helping slightly. Clara kept rubbing her back, whispering reassurances, but the worry on her face told the real story. She needed medicine, not just warmth. I finished the repair in about 40 minutes, working faster than I'd ever done for any paying customer. When I turned the key and the engine roared to life, Clara smiled for the first time since I'd met her, but that wheezing hadn't stopped. I have this old metal cash box we keep under the counter. My business partner Tim and I are supposed to deposit everything at the bank daily, but sometimes we're too tired. That night, there was about $650 in cash inside, money we've been saving for some new shop equipment. Clara was already thanking me, asking what she owed for the repair when I made a decision. I pulled 5 crisp hundreds from the box and held them out to her. Her eyes went wide, and she immediately started shaking her head. She explained they were just passing through Denver, heading to her sister's place in Utah. Her husband had left 6 months ago, and things had been tight. They couldn't accept money on top of the free repair. I'm not usually pushy, but seeing that little girl struggling to breathe made me insistent. Clara hesitantly explained that she was short on cash since her husband left, but promised she'd mail back the repair money as soon as she could. I waved it off and told her to focus on getting medicine for Emma first. There's something powerful about helping someone who needs it. I knew I'd have to replace that money tomorrow morning before Tim found out. It wasn't just mine to give away. I was already planning to stop by the ATM first thing to withdraw from my personal account. But in that moment, it felt like the only right thing to do. When Clara finally took the money, her hands were shaking. She tried to speak, but couldn't get the words out. Instead, she just nodded, tears mixing with melted snowflakes on her cheeks. The little girl was already breathing easier from just being in the warm shop, but she clearly needed proper medicine. I helped them back into their car, now running with heat blasting, and gave them directions to the nearest 24-hour pharmacy. Clara promised to pay me back someday. Somehow, I just waved her off. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid. As I watched their taillights disappear into the snowy night, I felt something shift inside me. Not pride or satisfaction, something deeper. A quiet certainty that I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do in that moment. I locked up the shop, climbed back into my coal truck, and headed home through the storm, thinking about how I'd explain the missing $500 to Tim if I couldn't get to the bank before he checked the cash box tomorrow. Johnny Cash was back on the radio, singing about the ways of the world. I cranked it up and sang along, suddenly not feeling so tired anymore. That should have been the end of it. A good deed on a bad night. The kind of story you tell over beers years later. Maybe even forget about eventually. I definitely never expected to hear from Clara and Emma again, and I certainly never expected them to completely change my life. But that's the thing about kindness. It has a way of coming back to you when you least expect it, and sometimes from the most unexpected directions. Little did I know that snowy night was just the beginning of a story I never saw coming. The universe has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. One moment you're feeling good about yourself for helping someone in need, and the next you're watching your whole life crumble right before your eyes. I woke up early the next morning, still feeling that warm glow from helping Clara and her daughter. The plan was simple. Stop by the ATM on my way to work, withdraw $500 from my personal account, and put it back in the shop's cash box before Tim noticed. No harm, no foul. I'd barely even be borrowing the money, just moving it between locations for about 12 hours. But we all know what they say about the best laid plans. The first sign of trouble was the ATM outside my regular gas station. The screen just froze after I put my card, completely locked up with that spinning wheel that never stopped spinning. I waited 5 minutes, cursing under my breath as the bitter morning wind cut through my jacket. Finally, I gave up and drove to another ATM a few miles away. Same damn result. System temporarily unavailable. Of all the mornings for a banking system outage, I checked my watch, already running late. Tim was always the first one in, unlocking the shop at 7:30 sharp. The guy was irritatingly punctual, especially for someone in the auto repair business, where every job takes twice as long as you think it will. My stomach was in knots as I pulled into the shop's parking lot at 8:15, 45 minutes late, and still without the $500 I needed to replace. Tim's pristine Honda Accord was already there, of course. The man had probably been inside since 7:25, just to prove a point. You can tell a lot about a person by how they dress for an auto shop. Most mechanics I know wear work clothes, jeans, sturdy boots, maybe a work shirt with their name embroidered on it. Not Tim. Even though our job involves getting covered in grease daily, he insisted on wearing a button-down shirt and tie under his coveralls. So it was about professionalism and standards. When I walked in that morning, Tim wasn't in his usual coveralls. He was standing behind the counter in just a shirt and tie, looking like he was about to conduct a job interview rather than fix a transmission. His arms were crossed, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. The cash box sat open on the counter between us, empty except for a few singles and some loose change. Morning. I managed, trying to sound casual while my heart hammered in my chest. System down at the bank? Tim didn't smile. Funny timing for that, isn't it? I hung my coat on the rack and headed for the coffee pot. It was already half empty. Tim must have been waiting a while. Look, I can explain about the money. I already know, Jeff. Tim cut me off, his voice cold. I saw everything on the security footage. The coffee in my mug suddenly tasted like battery acid. I'd completely forgotten about the shop security cameras. Tim had insisted on installing them last year after a string of catalytic converter thefts in the area. I'd never given them much thought. They were just blinking red lights in the corners of the ceiling to me. But they recorded everything. Me bringing in Clara and Emma. Me working on their car. Me opening the cash box and taking out $500. You were stealing from our business, Jeff. Our business. The way Tim emphasized our made it clear he no longer considered it shared. Taking money out of the register and pocketing it. I wasn't stealing, Tim. For God's sake, I was helping them. They were stranded in a blizzard with a sick kid. I was going to replace it this morning, but the ATMs are down. Call the bank if you don't believe me. Tim's face didn't soften. If anything, his expression hardened further. I watched the whole thing. You didn't log any service in the system. Didn't write up any paperwork. Just fixed their car off the books and took cash from our register. That's theft, plain and simple. The worst arguments are the ones where both people are right in their own way. From Tim's perspective, he caught me red-handed misappropriating funds. From mine, I'd made a judgment call in an emergency situation and was trying to make it right. But Tim and I had been different from the start. He was all about systems, processes, profit margins. I cared more about the people whose cars we fixed, the stories behind the dents and engine troubles. We've been partners for 8 years, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. You really think I'd steal from us? After all this time? Tim slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was a formal-looking document with a lot of legal language that basically said our partnership was dissolved. The shop is legally in my name, Jeff. Always has been. You were a working partner with a 40% stake. I'm buying you out, minus the $500 you stole. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. You can't do this. I already have. Clear out your tools by the end of the day. The drive home was a blur. I don't even remember stopping at traffic lights or making turns. My mind was replaying the last 8 years. All the cars we fixed together. The business we built from nothing. The customers who trusted us. All gone because I tried to help someone in need. Laura's car was in the driveway, which was unusual for this time of day. She worked as a school administrator and was typically gone until late afternoon. This day just kept getting better. She was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas, clutching her phone. When our eyes met, I knew Tim had already called her. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you steal from the shop?" Have you ever had one of those moments where you realize explaining is pointless? Where any defense you offer will sound hollow, no matter how true it is? I sat down across from Laura and told her everything. About Clara and Emma, the broken-down car, the asthma attack, the money. As I spoke, her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something like resignation. "So now you've lost your job," she said when I finished, "because you gave away money that wasn't yours to give." Put like that, it sounded so simple, so obviously wrong. "The bank called," she continued, sliding her phone across the table. "We missed the mortgage payment last week. I was going to transfer money from savings today, but..." She trailed off, but I understood. Our safety net was already stretched thin with our son's braces, and our daughter's school trip coming up. I'll find another job. I promised. There are other shops in Denver. Laura looked at me with tired eyes. The kids are already hearing things, Jeff. Tommy Jenkins at school told Ben his dad, says you were fired for stealing. Ever notice how bad news travels faster than light? Apparently. Tim had already spread the word to half of Denver. The rest of the day was a slow-motion nightmare. I drove back to the shop to collect my tools, enduring Tim's cold silence as I packed up 8 years of my life into my truck. I'd built some of those tool cabinets with my own hands. Now they'd stay behind while I left. By evening, my phone was blowing up with texts from friends and other mechanics, all asking versions of the same question. What happened? I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. The kids came home from school quiet and avoiding eye contact. Ben, my 14-year-old, went straight to his room without saying a word. Sarah, 12 going on 20, at least asked me directly if I'd been fired. When I tried to explain, she just nodded and said, "Mom already told us." The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than Tim's accusations. That night, I sat alone in our garage, surrounded by the tools of a trade I'd practiced for over 20 years. The concrete floor was cold, but I barely noticed. My phone buzzed occasionally, probably more questions I didn't want to answer. How does your life collapse so completely in less than 24 hours? Yesterday, I was a respected mechanic with a business and a reputation. Today, I was unemployed, possibly unhireable, with a mortgage payment overdue, and a family looking at me like I was a stranger, all because I tried to do the right thing. I kept thinking about Clara and Emma, wondering if they'd made it to Utah safely, if that $500 had helped get the medicine Emma needed, if they had any idea that their chance encounter with me in a snowstorm had upended my entire existence. Part of me wanted to be angry at them, but I couldn't. They hadn't asked for my help, hadn't asked me to give them money that wasn't mine to give. As I sat there on my toolbox in the cold garage, one thought kept circling back. What now? How do you rebuild when your foundation is gone? Where do you even start? I had no answers, just a hollow feeling in my chest and the sinking certainty that tomorrow wouldn't be any better. But sometimes life's darkest moments come right before an unexpected turn in the road. I just didn't know it yet. It's funny how time works when your life falls apart. A month can feel like a year and a heartbeat all at once. The 4 weeks after losing my job at the shop felt like an eternity of closed doors and sleepless nights. But somehow February had already melted into March with nothing to show for it. The garage had become my refuge, or maybe my prison. I'd set up a folding chair surrounded by my toolboxes and spent most evenings there, away from the disappointed looks from my family. It was colder than the house, but I hardly noticed anymore. The space heater humming in the corner took the edge off, but just barely. My dad's photo watched me from the wall, his faded smile frozen in the amber of 1974. He stood proudly in front of his own garage, sleeves rolled up, a wrench in one hand, and the other resting on the fender of a Chevy Impala. Dad had been a mechanic, too. 3 generations of Reid men with grease under their fingernails. The family legacy I'd somehow managed to destroy. What would you have done, Dad? I muttered to the photograph. Not for first time. The black and white image offered no answers, just that same confident smile that never wavered. The job search had gone nowhere. Denver has plenty of repair shops, but word travels fast in our business. Tim had made sure everyone knew his version of events, that I'd been caught stealing from the register on camera. No one wanted to hire a thief, no matter how skilled. I'd even tried the dealerships, swallowing my pride and applying for entry-level positions I was vastly overqualified for. Those went nowhere, too. Background checks and references were standard, and Tim was my only reference from the past 8 years. The mortgage company had started calling daily. We'd managed to make a partial payment from our emergency fund, but it wasn't enough. The grace period was running out. A few more weeks, and we'd be facing foreclosure notices. Upstairs, I could hear Laura moving around the kitchen, probably making dinner. She'd taken on extra hours at the school, working late to help with administrative backlog. The extra money helped, but the distance between us had grown with each passing day. Ben and Sarah weren't doing much better. My son had started spending most of his time at friend houses, coming home only to sleep and change clothes. Sarah at least still talked to me, but our conversations were strained, filled with awkward pauses and things left unsaid. I ran my fingers over the cold metal of my favorite socket wrench. It had been my father's, passed down when I first started apprenticing. The chrome was worn in places where 3 generations of hands had gripped it. Now it sat unused, a relic of a career that seemed to be over. The classified section of the newspaper lay open on my workbench, circled listings for jobs I'd already applied for and been rejected from. Warehouse work, delivery, driving, security guard, anything to bring in a paycheck. My phone buzzed with a text from Laura. Dinner in 10. Sarah has a project. Ben's staying at Jason's again. I texted back a simple, okay, and pocketed the phone. Another fragmented family dinner to look forward to. I stood up, my back cracking after sitting too long on the metal folding chair, and glanced at Dad's picture again. I was just trying to help someone, I said to the empty garage. Isn't that what you always taught me to do? The tools around me, some inherited, some purchased over decades of work, seemed to mock me with their specialized purposes. What good was knowing how to rebuild a transmission when I couldn't even rebuild my own life? Outside, the early March sun had already set, leaving the driveway in darkness except for the faint glow from the porch light. A car drove by slowly, probably a neighbor returning from work. From a normal day, with a normal job and a normal life, the doorbell rang. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. We didn't get many visitors these days. Friends had slowly stopped checking in as the weeks dragged on, and no one from the shop had reached out besides one awkward text from Jake, my former apprentice. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. I trudged up the steps from the garage to the kitchen. Laura was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like spaghetti sauce. She gave me a questioning look. I'll get it, I said, grateful for the momentary purpose. The porch light illuminated a slight figure through the frosted glass panel of our front door. Not the hulking silhouette of a debt collector. At least, I opened the door, bracing myself for whatever new problem had come knocking. And there she was. I recognized her immediately, though she looked different than she had that snowy night. Clara stood on my doorstep, her dark hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple coat that looked worn but clean. The desperation in her eyes had been replaced with something else, determination, maybe. For a moment, we just stared at each other. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. How had she found me? Why was she here? Mr. Reid? She asked, though she clearly knew who I was. Jeff Reid? I nodded mutely, still trying to make sense of her presence on my doorstep. A month ago, I'd never expected to see her again. Now here she was, standing in front of me like a ghost from a previous life. I went to your shop, she continued, her voice soft but steady. A young man there, Jake, I think, told me what happened, that you lost your job because of us, because of the money you gave me for Emma's medicine. So that's how she'd found me. Jake must have given her my address. I'd have to remember to thank him, or maybe curse him. I wasn't sure which yet. Behind me, I felt rather than saw Laura approach. Jeff? Who is it? Clara looked past me, seeming to notice my wife for the first time. I'm Clara Wilson. I'm the reason your husband lost his job. May I please come in? I need to talk to both of you. I stepped aside automatically, too stunned to do anything else. Clara entered our home with a cautious step, unwinding a scarf from her neck. No little girl followed her, and Emma must have been somewhere else. Clara helped my business partner conclude I was a thief. I explained to Laura, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. I fixed her car during the blizzard last month. Recognition dawned on Laura's face. I told her about Clara and Emma, but in the chaos of losing my job and our financial spiral, those details have been overshadowed by the consequences. Is your daughter okay? Laura asked of the mother first. Jeff said she was having trouble breathing that night. Clara nodded, a small smile softening her tired features. Emma's fine now. thanks to your husband. The medicine helped, and she's staying with my sister while She trailed off, glancing between us, while I try to make things right. We moved to the living room, the forgotten spaghetti sauce still simmering on the stove. Sarah peeked out from her bedroom once, curious about our visitor, but retreated when she saw the serious expressions on our faces. Clara sat perched on the edge of our couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I noticed her knuckles were red and chapped, like someone who works with water all day. I didn't know what happened until yesterday, she began. After that night, Emma and I continued to my sister's place in Utah. She's a respiratory therapist, which is why I was trying to get there in the first place. Emma's been doing better with the proper care. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. I came to return this, she said, placing on the coffee table between us. It's the $500, plus a little extra for repairs. I've been working double shifts at a diner in Salt Lake City to save it up. Laura looked at the envelope, then at me, confusion clear on her face. $500 wouldn't solve our problems now. Not with over $2,000 in missed mortgage payments and late fees piling up. That's not necessary, I started to say, but Claire insisted. Laura and I exchanged a glance. Even in our desperate situation, taking the money felt wrong somehow. After a silent conversation that only couples of many years can have, I gently pushed the envelope back toward Clara. Keep it for Emma, I said. We'll figure something out. Clara looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she took a deep breath. There's something else, she said. Another reason I came to find you. I waited, watching as she seemed to gather her thoughts. My husband, Emma's father, he was an inventor, she said. He passed away 3 years ago, but he left behind a workshop full of his projects, things he was working on, some of them automotive related. This wasn't what I had expected to hear at all, not even close. I've been trying to sort through it all, but I don't know the first thing about engines or mechanics, Clara continued. Before I sell the house, I need to know if any of it is valuable, if any of his work was important. There's a moment when you sense that your life is about to change again, for better or worse. You can't tell yet, but you know the ground is shifting beneath your feet once more. As Clara sat in my living room, I felt that tremor running through the foundations of my existence. You want me to look at your late husband's inventions? I asked, trying to make sure I understood. Clara nodded. I know it's asking a lot, especially after everything that happened. But Jake said you were the best mechanic he'd ever met, and I don't know who else to ask. Laura shifted beside me. Where's this workshop? Back in Salt Lake City, Clara said. I know it's far. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I glanced at Laura, seeing the doubt in her eyes. A trip to Utah wasn't exactly in our budget right now, but something about Clara's earnestness made me hesitate to dismiss the idea outright. What kind of projects are we talking about? I asked. That's just it. I don't really know, Clara admitted. There are drawings, prototypes, parts. He was working on something big before he died. Something he thought would change everything. But I never understood the technical details. As I looked at this woman sitting in my living room, this stranger who had somehow become entangled in the wreckage of my life, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced in weeks. Curiosity, maybe even a spark of hope. I can't promise anything, I said slowly, but I could take a look. The relief in Clara's eyes was immediate and profound. I can pay you, she assured me quickly. Not much, but something, and you can stay at the house while you're there. The practical part of my brain was throwing up red flags. This was crazy. I was unemployed, nearly broke, and contemplating a trip to Utah to look at some dead man's inventions? It made no sense. But after a month of closed doors and dead ends, even a wild chance felt better than no chance at all. Why me? I asked, genuinely puzzled. You could find a mechanic in Salt Lake. Clara's expression turned thoughtful. Because you helped us that night without expecting anything in return. That kind of person is rare, Mr. Reid. And my husband's work, it needs someone who cares about more than just money. The kitchen timer beeped insistently, reminding us of the abandoned dinner. Laura rose to check on it, her movement stiff with tension. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. "When would you need Jeff to come?" she asked Clara directly. "As soon as possible," Clara replied. "The house goes on the market in 3 weeks." That night, after Clara had left and the kids were in bed, Laura and I sat at the kitchen table, talking in low voices. The envelope of the $500 was still on the coffee table. Clara had forgotten it despite my attempts to return it. "It's crazy," Laura said, but there was less conviction in her voice than I'd expected. "Going all the way to Utah for what might be nothing." "Probably is nothing," I agreed. "But right now, nothing is exactly what we have here." Laura sighed, running her fingers through her hair, a nervous habit she'd had since college. "What if it's some kind of scam? We don't really know this woman." It was a fair point. But something about Clara struck me as genuine. And what would the scam even be? I had nothing worth taking. "What does your gut tell you?" Laura asked finally. My gut had been in knots for a month, but for the first time in weeks, I felt something different stirring there. Something like purpose. "I think I should go," I said. "At least take a look." Laura reached across the table and took my hand. Her expression was a complex mixture of worry, resignation, and something else, a faint glimmer of the partnership we'd once had before all this, before I'd become the disappointment living in the garage. "Then go," she said softly. "We'll manage here for a few days." As I packed a small bag the next morning, I tried not to think too hard about what I was doing, about the absurdity of driving to Utah, to look at some dead inventor's workshop, about all the reasons this was probably a waste of time and the little money we had left. Instead, I focused on a feeling that had taken root in my chest, an unfamiliar lightness that felt dangerously like hope. Maybe Clara's late husband's inventions would be worthless junk. Probably they would be, but they represented something I desperately needed right now. A possibility, a chance, however small, that I might still be useful, that my skills might still matter, that I might find a way to fix what had broken in my life. I tossed my toolbox in the truck and looked back at our house, where Laura stood in the doorway watching me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I might actually have a purpose again. Whatever waited for me in that workshop in Salt Lake City, it had to be better than sitting in my garage, watching my life crumble around me. Little did I know just how much that decision would change everything. The drive to Salt Lake City was long and quiet. Just me, my truck, and about 1,000 doubts keeping me company on the interstate. I'd made the trip in one straight shot, stopping only for gas, coffee, and to stretch my legs when the cabin fever got too intense. By the time I pulled onto Clara's Street, it was late afternoon the next day. The neighborhood wasn't anything fancy, just modest single-story homes with small yards and an occasional basketball hoop in the driveway. The kind of place where people worked hard just to make the mortgage, not so different from my own neighborhood back in Denver. Clara's house was toward the end of the block, a simple beige ranch style with white trim and a small porch. The yard needed some attention, with patches of brown grass poking to the melting snow, but it was neat enough. A child's bike lay on its side near the garage door, Emma's, I guessed. As I parked my truck along the curb, I wondered for the 100th time what the hell I was doing here. I'd driven across state lines on the word of a woman I barely knew, chasing some vague promise of, what exactly? A dead man's inventions? A miracle that would somehow fix my broken life? Clara must have heard my truck pull up because she opened the front door before I even made it halfway up the walkway. Emma stood slightly behind her, peeking out curiously. The little girl looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her. Cheeks rosy, no more desperate gasping for breath. "You really came," Clara said, relief evident in her voice. She'd clearly been worried I might change my mind. I shrugged, hefting my toolbox. Said I would deny. Inside, the house was modest but comfortable, the kind of home that's actually lived in, not just staged for visitors. Family photos lined the walls, including several of a lean, intense-looking man with kind eyes and a serious expression. Clara's late husband, I presumed, Emma's father. Toys were stacked in baskets along the living room wall, and textbooks on what looked like engineering subjects filled a small bookshelf. A half-finished puzzle dominated the coffee table. It was a home that had suffered loss, but was still functioning, still moving forward. "Emma, this is Mr. Reid," Clara said. "He's a mechanic who helped us when our car broke down, remember?" Emma nodded shyly. "Thank you for fixing our car," she said softly, then darted back toward what I assumed was her bedroom. "She's been through a lot," Clara explained, watching her daughter go. "But she's doing better now. Kids are resilient," I said. Thinking of my own, I called Laura from the road to let her know I'd arrived safely. Our conversation had been brief, practical, the distance between us measured in more than just miles. After a quick tour of the house and some much-needed coffee, Clara led me what I'd come to see, her husband's workshop. It wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of some high-tech lab or fancy setup, it was simply their detached garage, converted with workbenches along the walls and shelving units crammed with tools, parts, and binders full of notes. "Daniel was always out here," Clara said, flipping on the lights. "Sometimes, all night. He taught engineering at the community college, but this was his real passion." The central feature of the space was a large table covered in blueprints and technical drawings, held down by various tools and parts. Behind it, partially covered by a tarp, was what looked like some kind of engine assembly. Not a car engine, at least not like any I'd ever worked on. It was smaller, more compact, with unusual configurations of parts. "He called it his hybrid retrofit system," Clara explained, watching my face. "That's probably not the right technical term. He wanted to make something that could convert any standard engine to use less gas without sacrificing power. Something affordable that ordinary people could install in their existing cars." I let out a low whistle, circling the table to get a better look at the blueprints. "That's the holy grail for lot car owners," I said, "especially with gas prices the way they are." Clara nodded. "He was obsessed with it. Said the big auto companies had no interest in true fuel efficiency because it would hurt their bottom line. He wanted to create something for the everyday person." Over the next hour, I pored over Daniel's notes and drawings. The guy had been methodical, documenting every test, every failure, every adjustment. His handwriting was precise, his diagrams detailed. This wasn't some crackpot inventor with delusions of grandeur. This was serious engineering. The core of his idea seemed to be a new kind of hybrid system that could be installed as an aftermarket modification to existing vehicles. Most current hybrids were built from the ground up as hybrid cars. Daniel had been trying to create something that could be retrofitted to conventional engines, dramatically improving their fuel efficiency while maintaining performance. Did he ever get it working? I asked, looking up from a particularly detailed schematic. Clara shook her head. "Not fully. He was close, I think. That's the prototype," she said, gesturing to the partially covered assembly. "But after he died, heart attack, completely unexpected. I didn't know what to do with all this. I don't have the technical knowledge to understand if his work was valuable or just wishful thinking." There was a vulnerability in her voice that made me look up. Clara wasn't just asking me to evaluate some mechanical gadgets. She was asking me to tell her if her husband's life's work had meant something. "Let me take a closer look at that prototype," I said, rolling up my sleeves. The next several hours disappeared as I lost myself in Daniel's work. It was the most engaged I'd felt in months. The familiar comfort of mechanical problems to solve, of systems to understand. This was my language, even if Daniel's specific dialect was more advanced than mine. The prototype was ingenious. It used a small secondary motor and a series of capacitors to capture energy normally lost during braking and idling, then fed that power back into the system during acceleration. The integration with the vehicle's existing engine management system was where Daniel seemed to have gotten stuck. Finding a way to make his system communicate seamlessly with the car's onboard computer. By the time I looked up, it was dark outside, and Clara was standing in the doorway with a plate of sandwiches and a concerned expression. "You've been out here for 6 hours, she said, setting the plate on a clear corner of the workbench. "Thought you might be hungry." I stretched, feeling my back crack from hunching over the workbench for so long. Lost track of time, I admitted, reaching for a sandwich. "Your husband was onto something here. Clara, something potentially big." Hope flickered across her face. Really? It wasn't just his obsession. No, this is solid engineering, I said. The theory is sound. He just hit some practical hurdles in the implementation. The kind that someone with hands-on mechanical experience might be able to solve. Clara sat down on a shop stool, her expression cautious but eager. Someone like you mean? I took a bite of the sandwich to give myself time to think. PB&J, the universal fuel of garage tinkerers everywhere. It tasted like long nights fixing up my first car as a teenager. Maybe, I said finally, I'm not an engineer, like your husband, but I've been fixing cars since I was 16. I understand how engines breathe, how they move, what makes them tick. Sometimes that practical knowledge is what you need to bridge the gap between theory and application. Clara was watching me intently, something sparking behind her eyes. What if... She started, then paused, seeming to gather her courage. What if we work together on this? You have the mechanical expertise. I have all of Daniel's research and notes. If we could get a system working, it could be valuable. I finished for her. Very valuable. I'm not talking about getting rich, Clara said quickly. I just want to honor Daniel's work. And maybe it could help both of us get back on our feet. The proposition hung in the air between us. I barely knew this woman, had met her exactly twice in my life, and yet here we were, discussing a potential partnership that could change everything. It was crazy, but then again, what did I have to lose? I need to take some of these specs and notes back to Denver, I said, thinking out loud. Maybe the prototype too, if you're comfortable with that. I have a workshop set up in my garage. Nothing fancy, but enough to tinker with this. Clara nodded, relief washing over her face. So you'll help? I'll try, I said, careful not to promise too much. I can't guarantee anything, but yeah, I'll give it my best shot. We spent the next hour gathering the most essential materials. Key blueprints, Daniel's notebooks, component lists, and the central module of the prototype itself. It wasn't the entire system, but it was the heart of it, the part that would need the most refinement. As I packed it all carefully into plastic storage bins to drive back, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected. Excitement. Real, genuine excitement. The kind I used to feel when tackling a challenging repair job or solving a tricky mechanical problem. If this works, Clara said, helping me load the bins into my truck, we split everything 50-50. Any patents, any licensing deals, whatever comes of it. Daniel would have wanted his work to help people. I nodded, oddly touched by her earnestness. 50-50 sounds more than fair, considering I'm just a grease monkey here. The drive back to Denver the next day felt entirely different from the journey out. Where before my mind had been full of doubts and dead ends, now it was racing with possibilities. Ideas for modifications to Daniel's system, potential solutions to the integration problems, ways to simplify the installation process for the average mechanic. I called Laura from the road, trying to explain what I'd found without sounding like I'd lost my mind. She sounded skeptical, understandably so, but at least she was willing to give me the space to pursue this. Maybe she heard the change in my voice, the return of something that had been missing for weeks. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Denver, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark, except for the porch light Laura had left on for me. I unloaded just one of the bins, the one with the prototype module, and carried it straight to my garage workshop. Sleep could wait. I needed to see if my hunch was right. The next week passed in a blur of grease, solder, and late nights. I divided my time between job hunting during the day, still necessary, still discouraging, and working on Daniel's system at night. Ben and Sarah got used to finding me in the garage at all hours, hunched over the workbench, muttering to myself like some mad scientist. Daniel's design was elegant but over-engineered in places. Where he created complex electronic solutions, I found mechanical workarounds. Where he'd struggled with computer integration, I simplified the approach, focusing on what was essential for performance. We were a good team, in a way. The brilliant but theoretical engineer and the practical mechanic, working across time and space to solve a common problem. I kept Clara updated with daily calls, sharing my progress and asking questions about her husband's notes when I ran into something I couldn't decipher. She seemed genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions that showed she'd absorbed more of Daniel's work than she gave herself credit for. And then, on day 9 it happened. I'd been working on a simplified version of the control module, stripping it down to its essential functions and rebuilding it to interface more seamlessly with a standard engine control unit. Around 2 a.m., I connected the last wire, checked all my connections, and hooked the system up to the small test engine I'd pulled from an old lawnmower. My hands were actually shaking as I made the final connections. This was the moment of truth. Either this would work, or I'd wasted over a week of precious time on a wild goose chase. I took a deep breath and flipped the switch. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life with a smooth, steady purr that was noticeably different from its usual rough idle. The sound was efficient, clean, powerful, unbelievable, I whispered, staring at the readout on my multimeter. The system was working exactly as Daniel had predicted in his notes, capturing energy and feeding it back into the power cycle. The fuel consumption meter I'd rigged up showed a reduction of nearly 40% at idle. I grabbed my phone and dialed Clara without thinking about the time. "Jeff?" she answered groggily. "Is everything okay?" "It works," I said, laughing like a maniac in my garage at 2 a.m. "Clara, it actually works. Your husband's system works." There was a moment of silence, and then I heard a sound that might have been a sob. "Really? You got it working?" "Just the basic proof of concept," I clarified, trying to contain my excitement. "It's hooked up to a small test engine. We've got a long way to go before it's ready for a real car. But the core technology, it's sound. It does exactly what Daniel said it would." After I hung up with Clara, I just sat there on my garage floor, staring at the humming prototype. The implications were starting to sink in. If this worked at scale, if we could adapt it to actual cars and trucks, it could change everything. Not just for Clara and me personally, though that was significant enough, but for everyone who struggled with fuel costs, for the environment, for the future of transportation. I thought about Tim and the shop I'd lost, about my family and the strain of the past months, about all the closed doors and dead ends. And suddenly, none of it seemed to matter quite as much anymore, because sitting in front of me was something that might just be the beginning of a whole new chapter. But as I sat there watching the engine run with Daniel's creation, giving it new life, one nagging question kept circling in my mind. What would happen next? Could a simple mechanic and a widowed mother actually bring something this potentially valuable to the world? Or were we just setting ourselves up for an even bigger fall? I had no idea what the morning would bring, but for the first time in months, I was genuinely excited to find out. They say the journey 1,000 miles begins with a single step. What they don't tell you is how many times you'll trip, fall, and have to pick yourself back up along the way. Standing in the gleaming exhibition hall of the Detroit Auto Show exactly 1 year after that snowy night, when I'd helped a stranded mother and daughter, I could hardly believe the path that had brought me here. The banner above our booth read Jeff Reid Hybrid Systems in bold letters, with a tagline underneath. The future of efficiency is now. Our display wasn't the largest or the flashiest at the show. The major automakers still dominated with their concept cars and elaborate stages. But our modest setup had drawn the biggest crowd of industry insiders, journalists, and curious engineers. Word had spread fast after our early demonstration videos went viral 3 months ago. The prototype we'd installed in my old Ford F-150 had increased its fuel efficiency by 34% in real-world driving conditions, without sacrificing power or requiring expensive batteries. The system could be installed in almost any vehicle for a fraction of the cost of buying a new hybrid or electric car. Clara stood next to me at the podium, professional in a simple navy suit, but with the same determined look in her eyes I'd first noticed on my doorstep a year ago. Emma was back in Salt Lake with Clara's sister, watching the live stream of our presentation. My family was right in the front row, Laura beaming with pride, Ben and Sarah recording everything on their phones to share with their friends. The past year had been a whirlwind of sleepless nights, prototype refinements, patent applications, and increasingly excited meetings with investors. We'd formed our company, secured seed funding, and built a team of engineers to help perfect Daniel's vision. Clara had moved to Denver with Emma, so we could work together more closely, renting a small apartment near our newly leased workshop space. What had started as an unlikely partnership between a desperate mechanic and a determined widow had grown into something neither of us could have imagined. And today was the culmination of it all. Our official launch to the automotive world. The industry representative introducing us was running through our backgrounds, but I barely heard his words. I was too busy thinking about how close I'd come to missing this opportunity altogether, how easily I could have driven past that stranded car in a blizzard, or refused Clara's request to look at her husband's workshop. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Jeff Reid and Clara Grace, the co-founders of what might just be the most significant aftermarket innovation of the decade. The presenter concluded, gesturing for us to take the stage. The spotlight felt hot and strange. I wasn't used to this kind of attention. Give me a garage and an engine any day over a stage and a microphone. But Clara had coached me through our presentation, and I knew my part well. The practical mechanic who would help bring a brilliant engineer's vision to life. For the next 20 minutes, we presented our system to the assembled crowd. I handled the technical explanation of how it worked, while Clara spoke about the market potential and our vision for affordable efficiency improvements for existing vehicles. When we unveiled the cutaway demonstration model, showing the system in action, a collective murmur ran through the crowd. You can't fake results in the automotive world, and our results spoke for themselves. As the presentation ended and the applause washed over us, I caught sight of a familiar face at the back of the crowd. Tim Barrett, watching with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met briefly before he turned and disappeared into the throng of attendees. The rest of the day was a blur of handshakes, business cards, and increasingly generous offers. Major auto parts manufacturers wanted distribution rights. Car companies wanted to discuss factory installations. Environmental groups praised our potential impact on emissions reduction. By evening, when we finally retreated to our hotel suite for a private celebration with our families and core team, we had 7 different acquisition offers on the table, the highest at $50 million, with generous ongoing royalties and leadership positions for both Clara and me. Laura popped the champagne bottle, filling glasses for everyone, sparkling cider for the kids and those who didn't drink. To second chances, she toasted, her eyes meeting mine with the warmth that had been rekindled over the past year. Our marriage had weathered the storm and come out stronger for it. And to Daniel, Clara added softly, raising her glass, whose vision made all of this possible. I pulled out the worn photo of my father that I kept in my pocket all day. He would have loved to see this. His son carrying on the family tradition of fixing things, just on a much bigger scale than any of us could have imagined. 3 months later, the deal was finalized. We had gone with the offer that best preserved Daniel's vision, ensuring the technology would be affordable and widely available. The final figure was $53 million, split equally between Clara and me as we'd agreed that first night in her husband's workshop. The money mattered, of course. It meant security for our families, college fund for our kids, freedom from the financial pressures that had nearly broken us. But what mattered more was the validation, that helping someone on a snowy night had ultimately led to something that would help millions more. I used my share to buy a large property on the outskirts of Denver, a sprawling ranch house with enough land for the kids to roam, and a massive workshop space where I could continue tinkering. Laura left her job at the school and started a small foundation focused on educational resources for underprivileged students. But there was one more thing I needed to do. Reid's Auto Education Center read the sign above the completely renovated building that had once been Barrett and Reid Auto Repair. The old shop had come up for sale just as our deal closed. Tim had apparently decided to retire early and move to Florida. I bought it immediately, not out of nostalgia, but with a clear vision of what it could become. The front half remained a working garage, offering affordable repairs to the community. The back half had been transformed into a training center where disadvantaged youth could learn automotive skills from experienced mechanics, including me, 3 days a week. Jake, my former apprentice, had eagerly signed on as a head instructor. "This beats working for Tim any day," he'd said with a grin on opening day. Though I have to admit, sending Clara to your house was the best career move I ever made. The center had been open for just 2 weeks when a familiar Honda Accord pulled into the parking lot one afternoon. I was working with a group of students on hybrid diagnostics when Jake poked his head into the classroom. "Someone here to see you, boss," he said, with a meaningful look. "Says it's important." Tim Barrett looked older than when I'd last seen him up close. His perfectly pressed shirt was the same, but his shoulders seemed to have gained a permanent stoop, and his thinning hair had gone completely gray. "Jeff," he said, as I stepped out into the reception area. "Place looks different." "That's the idea," I replied, wiping my hands on a shop rag. Neither of us seemed to know what to do next. A handshake felt wrong after everything that had happened. Tim cleared his throat. "I saw the news about your invention. Quite a success story." I nodded, waiting. Tim hadn't come here to make small talk about my success. "I wanted to." He started, then stopped, frowning. "Look, I was wrong. About you, about the money." I jumped to conclusions, and I cost us both the business we'd built. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Tim, it was probably as close as he could manage. "Life teaches us all different lessons," I said after a moment, "some harder than others." Tim nodded, glancing around at the students visible through the classroom windows. "You're doing good things here," he said quietly. "Better than we ever did just fixing cars." As he turned to leave, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. The bitterness I'd harbored toward Tim had no place in my life anymore. It belonged to a different chapter, one that was firmly closed. That evening, as the summer sun set over our new property, I sat on the back porch watching Ben show Sarah some basketball moves in the driveway. Laura was inside, planning her foundation's first scholarship program. Clara and Emma would be joining us for a barbecue later. Our families had grown close over the past year of working together. I thought about how differently things could have turned out if I'd driven past that stranded car, if I'd never given away that $500, if I'd let my pride keep me from accepting Clara's invitation to Utah. So many small decisions, seemingly insignificant in the moment, that ended up changing everything. The universe has a strange way of working sometimes. I had lost everything because I stopped to help a stranger, and then I gained everything back, and more because that same stranger returned to help me. They say no good deed goes unpunished. Maybe that's true sometimes, but I've come to believe that kindness has a way of rippling outward, creating patterns we can't always see from where we stand. The consequences aren't always immediate, and the path isn't always straight, but somehow the circle completes itself. Daniel's invention had changed countless lives, reducing emissions, saving money for families struggling with gas prices, creating jobs at our new manufacturing facilities. His legacy lived on in ways he never could have imagined, and my own legacy had been transformed too. No longer just a mechanic fixing what was broken, but someone who helped build something new, someone who saw potential where others saw only problems. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I thought about that snowy night that had started it all, about how close I'd come to losing everything, about how sometimes the worst moment of your life can lead to the best. If you're willing to keep moving forward, keep believing there's something better ahead. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Take the next step, fix what we can, help who we can, and trust that somewhere down the road, all makes sense in the end. Turns out, my father was right all along. The most important tool in any mechanic's arsenal isn't a wrench or a screwdriver. It's the willingness to get your hands dirty, helping others when they need it most.